Hello and assalamu alaikum. Welcome to our event for today. Asif has presented Afghanistan 1 year review, setbacks, progress, and path forward. Hello and assalamu alaikum. Welcome to our event for today. As we're setting up, we are starting right now. Please bear in mind this event is for everyone to come together and have a better understanding of what happened in the past year and how we could move forward. Um, a little bit about ASIF, Afghan Sustainable Economic Foundation, the organization we are working for. My name is Golmeki. I am one of the co-founder along with others. Our mission at Afghan Sustainable Economic Foundation, ASIF, is to advocate for economic solutions for Afghanistan that will enable its people to stand on their own feet and not be a burden on the international community. Our organization's aim is to identify, provide, innovate means to spur job growth, provide food security, and eliminate extreme poverty. We aim to facilitate discussions between experts and policymakers to produce practical solutions in overcoming the current crisis, achieve long-term economic sustainability for Afghanistan. We have our co-host, Michelle, who will be speaking next. She is the Outreach Director of ASIF. So I will give the mic to Michelle.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. As you said, my name is Michelle. I'm the Outreach Director at ASIF. I won't take too much of your time. We have a lot planned for today. But I would like to introduce our Executive Director, Mr. Tawab Hamidi, and I will pass the mic to him. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle and Sister Gumakai, uh, for planning this and doing this together. Michelle, if you can also bring some of our speakers up in the meantime. First and foremost, I want to thank our esteemed speakers and the participants who've joined us. I hope today's session will be educational and insightful. I also want to remind all of you that ASIF has recently launched a video titled Impact of a Failed Afghan State. It's pinned on our Twitter homepage with a link to the video. So please, when you have a chance, look through it. It's a short video. We also have many project initiatives to help the people of Afghanistan by empowering them with jobs. If you're interested in helping, volunteering, please reach out to us. Please also follow us on social media posts, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok. As a general disclaimer, we don't hold the views of the speaker and they're independent. The speakers are all individual participants with no links to each other, and they each have their own positions and perspectives. For many of them, I believe this is the first time they're in a space together or will be hearing from each other. We also have one more additional speaker who will be joining us later in the program. Who's actually a female Afghan based in Afghanistan, because we wanted to hear a perspective from somebody who's on the ground. And she will also be joining us later in the program. So to begin with, and on an important note, the past 43 years of continuous war in Afghanistan has impacted Afghans and has left many of us with deep wounds and scars. And unfortunately, those wounds have not healed. It has also, unfortunately, left the people of Afghanistan deeply divided, polarized along ethnic lines and ideological lines. And it has exacerbated identity politics in Afghanistan. It has reached a stage where people from the same town, same area, same province are not able to have a civil discourse and agree to disagree. Because of this phenomenon of identity politics, some folks even objected that we wanted speakers to mention any progress that has occurred in Afghanistan in the past year. And I pray and hope that the people of Afghanistan can reach a stage where we can have civil discourse amongst the different groups or amongst us without the vitriol and the deep animosity that surrounds it today. So with that said, I'd like to introduce our first leader, our first STEAM leader, who is, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Stephanie Glinsky today. She's a courageous journalist who's been covering Afghanistan for the past 4 years. Stephanie has covered Afghanistan for The Guardian and many other news outlets. She's been to almost every Afghan province, and since the takeover of Taliban, she's revisited most of those places as well. And it's our pleasure to hear from her on the ground realities of what's happening in Afghanistan and the humanitarian condition in Afghanistan. So, with that said, Michelle, if sorry, Stephanie, if let me bring you up as a Stephanie. I've sent a request to accept to come up as a speaker. If you can please accept it, or if you can actually make the request below where it has the icon, mic icon.
I tried to send her invite if she is okay. She's on.
Hello.
Hello,
Okay.
Stephanie. Thank you so much for making time and joining us. We can hear you.
Hello. Perfect. Yeah, my pleasure to join everybody this evening here, and I guess morning time in the U.S. So yeah, as you said, I was in Afghanistan immediately after the Taliban took over last year in August, and I stayed there for several months, and then have been in Afghanistan throughout the past year. And of course, I've been reporting from there for a long time, but at the same time, this is, of course, Afghanistan's story, and these are the story of Afghans. So that's exactly what I'll be focusing on today, telling the stories of the people who are directly affected by what's happened in the last year, and not just in the last year, but also over the last 40 years, of course. And I think that's exactly what I want to start with. We can't forget that there have been 40 years of war in Afghanistan. First, Soviet Union, the Civil War, the Islamic Emirate during the 90s, the Republic, the US invasion, and then again last year the resurgent Taliban and the Islamic Emirate. So whenever I have spoken to people over the last years, the main thing that always came up was, I'm tired of this war, of the killings, the insecurity, the suffering. And of course, what happened last year in August, there was this initial absolute fear of what's going to happen, immediately following August. And at the same time, very quickly, people said they were glad that it's gotten quieter. We can't forget that more than 50,000 civilians died over the last 20 years, and that's just civilian numbers. Of course, there are much more soldiers, police officers who were killed over the last 20 years. So huge human toll. One of the first provinces I visited when I returned in August was Wardak, and I was with a family who had been living right on the front line, and they were telling me that pretty much right before the Taliban took Wardak province, they were hiding almost every day in a sort of cow shed that was underground. They kept the animals. They actually walked me there, a pretty dark and suffocating space, and they said that's where they'd been spending most of their time, because they were so scared of the fighting, and most of them had been injured by bullets, by shrapnel. They were showing me the injuries, and they said, we don't support the Taliban, we don't support this regime. For us, we're glad it's gotten quieter. So yeah, I've traveled throughout Afghanistan to different provinces in the past year. One thing I think that surprised me quite a bit, especially being out west, was there were quite large stretches of land where you wouldn't see any presence of anybody, essentially. No police, no soldiers, nobody. That was out west in Farah, in Nimruz as well. You have these large stretches of deserted land, essentially, with no checkpoints, and that was worrying to see. seeing this kind of lack of any sort of presence, and kind of leaving an open door there for, for crime to happen, potential crimes to happen, and for no sort of presence for the villages in those areas. Um, so crime was another topic or issue I wanted to address. Of course, the last year has brought a lot of desperation in terms of the economic situation. A lot of people have their bank funds frozen. They can't access money. A lot of people have lost their jobs. A lot of people were employed by people who have left the country, so they lost those jobs too. And petty crime has been on the rise. I went to a couple of hospitals in, when was that? Beginning of this year. So in winter, January, February time. And what I've been told by a lot of the doctors is that, we used to have a lot of people from explosions from the war, and we were treating those. And what we're treating today mostly are gunshot injuries. Um, People who've been injured by petty crime, by burglars who are trying to steal and to get to money. So that, I guess, brings me a bit to talking about the humanitarian situation. If we look at the Afghan economy in the past year, it's shrunk by 30%, according to the U.S. Institute for Peace. And the World Bank has said that about 70% of people can't afford food and basic necessities. So with the Taliban coming last year, of course, funds were frozen, development aid ceased, sanctions were imposed, and this kind of situation, no country could have been able to deal with harsh realities like this. So what happened was pretty much inevitable with the sanctions, with the frozen funds, the development aid ceasing. And then at the same time, you have the Taliban take over, well, they didn't have sufficient people to run a country with almost 40 million people, who've been running an insurgency for a very long time, of course. But at the same time, plenty of qualified people left, including a lot of people who were working in the finance and the economy sector. And that's definitely left a large gap. And we've seen at the same time journalists who've been tortured, who've been harassed. We've heard about reported killings of former government employees. And bringing all of this together, the realities on the ground for people in the cities, but also in areas outside the cities, became really, really difficult. You at the one point, you had the fear. People were living in this fear of this new government that they could only remember from the past. So there were a lot of hangover fears and uncertainties of what's supposed to be happening, what is going to happen. And at the same time, people were dealing with the daily realities of not having funds, of not having enough food, of not having access to healthcare at the same time. I was walking in Kabul a couple of weeks ago, just along one of the main roads, and one of the things that really struck me was seeing people outside the banks line up just the same way they did about a year ago when the Taliban first came to Kabul and when funds were first frozen at the banks. You see that still today. So a lot of people are still trying to get money from the banks. They're still trying to survive, basically. There have been, of course, as I mentioned, things that have gotten maybe a little bit easier for some people. People are traveling throughout Afghanistan a bit more. In terms of mobility, corruption has also been down a bit. There was recently a report from the Cross-Border Conflict Evidence Policy and Trends Research Program, which was funded by UK Aid, and they were detailing checkpoints and the centralization of taxation of these checkpoints and how that has contributed to corruption throughout Afghanistan going down, which of course is a positive. But at the same time, of course, we can't ignore the other realities that I've mentioned. We have the healthcare sector that has deteriorated significantly since the Taliban takeover, and the sector is recovering, but it needs some time to recover. A lot of these funds have been cut. Um, I visited hospitals in Kandahar, in Kabul, in different provinces where you had families with malnourished children, with children who have been sick, but parents who didn't have access to medical care in the districts that they were living in. So a lot of them had been traveling long distances. Of course, that was the case before as well for many families. At the same time, we also have a lot of minorities who say they no longer feel safe. We've seen a lot of attacks on the Hazara community, especially. We've seen that in Kunduz, in Kandahar, recently in Kabul, again and again, at schools, at mosques. We've had the attack of the Sikh temple last month. And again, you have a lot of people who are saying we don't feel safe in our country. This is our country, Afghanistan. But at the same time, we no longer feel safe. This has become a place where we don't feel we can live anymore. We can't have, we can't send our children to school. We can't go to the mosque to pray. So all these fears are very, very real. And at the same time, you have women talking about not being able to go to school, not having a future. So desperation, that front, of course, is very real. So I guess to summarize, I think what we've seen in the last year is that the humanitarian situation, the economy, the daily lives of Afghans have been significantly affected, and that's something that affects every aspect of life. People can't afford food. At the same time, people are saying that some areas, or that areas throughout the country have gotten quieter. Of course, there's less fighting. The casualty numbers have significantly decreased over the past year. And at the same time, it's now realities such as hunger and unemployment that people are struggling with on a daily basis. Women are struggling with the lack of schooling, and the lack of jobs for them. So overall, a difficult situation for Afghans throughout the country. And a lot of people said, especially right after the Taliban took over last year in August, we'll have to see how things develop. And on some fronts, that has been quite alarming, especially if we're looking at the situation of women, of education for women, for girls who are still not able to go to school from grade 7 on. And I think, we'll have to see how things continue, of course. Some funds have returned so far, but at the same time, people are still living in desperate poverty and going through an economic crisis, a humanitarian crisis that is anything but over.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Stephanie, we will have Q&A later, but in the meantime, had a couple of quick questions. One, in regards to safety of travel, right? How easy is it for people to travel from one place, one province to another today versus before? And as it relates to minorities, because unfortunately they have uh, they received the brunt of the attacks from ISIS these days. How much effort is the Islamic Emirates putting towards protecting these minorities from attacks from, let's say, ISIS?
Sure. Let me get back to you on that first question. So you were talking about mobility, and of course, again, I would like to say this again. I am talking as an international journalist, who is having, of course, a much easier time traveling throughout Afghanistan. I've been accredited as a journalist, and I've been able to travel throughout the country without any problems. But again, I'm talking as a foreign journalist. This has been a very, very different reality. If you're looking at the work that Afghan female journalists have been doing, who've been having a lot more problems, not just female journalists, We've had journalists being detained, journalists being tortured, as I mentioned before. So what I'm describing is, of course, the perspective that I've experienced, and that is, of course, different from my Afghan colleagues, and of course can differ very much from other people. In terms of mobility, however, prior to the Taliban's takeover last August, of course, there were a lot of front lines that you would have to cross if you were traveling throughout the country. So there was always the danger of being caught in some sort of crossfire. A lot of people who came to hospitals in Kabul with gunshot injuries were coming from the central highland provinces, traveling via Wardak, got into the crossfire, and then were injured. At times badly, and lost legs or even died. So you always had this danger of being caught in some sort of crossfire. And of course, there were areas that were controlled by the Taliban even prior to them taking Afghanistan and creating their Islamic Emirate. So there were areas of the country where people wouldn't go, where people would say it's too dangerous to go on this road. Nuristan was one of these provinces where a lot of people wouldn't dare to travel. A lot of people would prefer to fly to even to Mazar Sharif or Herat, because you would have to cross through a lot of areas where the Taliban was controlling parts of the road, and people didn't feel safe to do that. I've had a lot of conversations with truck drivers previously who were driving on the Kabul-Kandahar highway, on the ring road that essentially goes through Kabul to Kandahar, Helmand, and Herat. And they would have to pay taxes to the Taliban at that time, and that was 2-3 years ago. So those roads would be frequented by truck drivers, by people who had to do work, but a lot of civilians were too afraid to travel, and essentially would avoid travel at all cost. So the second thing
Would
you were
you,
sorry,
sorry, Stephanie, just a quick point regarding that. One of the concerns that a lot of Afghans had in the past, including myself every time I visited, was abductions, right? Abductions was a bigger threat than you getting blown up somewhere. Is that still the case? Are abductions rampant today versus like a year ago? Has there been any progress in that regards?
So the only thing I would add to that is that there have been areas. I was in Mazar-e Sharif, for example. When was that? That would have been in January this year, where I've been hearing reports from local people saying that there had been a number of abductions, and those were pretty much because people wanted to extort money. The desperation with the economic situation, the humanitarian crisis, and abductions happening because of that, because of people wanting to extort money from families who might have been more wealthy. So while the nature possibly, and I say that very carefully, could have changed, I wouldn't exclude the fact that those are still happening. And at the same time, we've also been hearing reports such as the report that Human Rights Watch has been releasing about people disappearing, former government employees being killed. So I again say that very, very carefully, and as I said, mobility generally has been easier as you are not crossing front lines anymore. And at the same time, people are still careful, and I think rightly so. And at the same time, like I said, it has definitely become easier to travel throughout different provinces. There are no front lines to cross, and there's no ongoing fighting on major roads or major highways that could endanger the lives of people as it has before. I mean, before we were looking at an active war where the former government was fighting the Taliban, and right now we don't have these two sides actively fighting anymore.
Thank you, Stephanie. One last point. UNAMA reported that there were 700 deaths in the first 10 months of the Islamic Emirates taking over. these are killings, of course, mostly by ISIS attacks. According to Brown University, on an annual basis, there were 20,083 casualties due to war in the past 20 years on an annual basis. So 20,000, going from 20,000 to 700, that's per year. I would say a significant change. Do you believe that um, rural Afghanistan, especially in the south, has seen more safety and security and some progress versus other areas?
So I think what's especially important with these numbers is that we have to keep in mind that these also include casualty numbers of soldiers, both from the former government side and the Taliban, right? So that is not just civilians. So the majority of people who did die over the
Of
last
course,
20
of
years
course.
are soldiers, are combatants who have been killed. And of course, right now, as I said before, there's no fighting going on. So all of these deaths that were happening before are currently not happening, because we do not have a scenario where an active war is being fought. The Taliban last year took hold of Afghanistan, established the Islamic Emirate, and right now they are in control of Afghanistan, for better or worse, whether people like that or not. Attacks are still happening, of course. We've seen a lot of the Islamic State attacks, and especially in the past weeks and the past months. But at the same time, the Islamic Emirate has been established, and the active war is currently not being fought.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Stephanie, if you could stay with us for Q&A, we'll move on to our next esteemed speaker. And if you can also go on mute for now, I'd appreciate it. And I'd like to next introduce our dear friend, I would like to call him, Adam Weinstein. Adam is no stranger to Asif. He participated in one of our first events back in February of this year, I believe, which focused on the frozen funds and its allocation to the 9/11 family. Adam is a researcher, a research fellow at the Quincy Institute, focuses on security, trade, and rule of law in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Adam has worked. Adam's work has been featured in Foreign Policy, War on the Rocks, Lawfare, and the National Interest. He has worked for KPMG in the past and was a consultant for the University of Maryland. He also worked as a senior law and policy analyst with numerous groups to draft legislation on rescinding the travel ban during the Trump era. Adam received his JD from Temple University Beasley School of Law, with a concentration in international and transitional justice. Whatever I say will not do justice to his profile and the work he's done. I deem him as a friend of the Afghan people. Adam, it's our pleasure to have you speak. If you can, of course, speak on the frozen funds and also counterterrorism, greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. I think that's too kind of an introduction, but thank you anyway. I'm only going to focus on things from the U.S. perspective and maybe regional diplomacy, because I don't think I'm qualified to talk too much about the internal dynamics of Afghanistan right now. I think that's better left to either Afghans or people who are inside the country. But first, I want to, open this with, how do I put this? I think we need to be really realistic about what's possible and not possible at this time, vis-a-vis U.S. relations with Afghanistan. Because for the last 20 years, what we've done is we've kind of talked in fantastical terms, and we've talked in these with very lofty language, and that's where we got a lot of empty promises from. So the first reality is that I don't think it can be exaggerated just how little attention most of the U.S. government is paying to Afghanistan. In the stack of papers that's on President Biden's desk, I think, this is a metaphor, but Afghanistan is pretty low in that stack. I think the White House is preoccupied with China, Ukraine, the economy in the United States, midterms, divisions at home, and Afghanistan just doesn't matter to them. And that's the reality. And that's a reality that I think activists in the diaspora need to understand. That's a reality that I think the Taliban probably need to understand and don't understand. And so that's where we're starting from. So in terms of, and it's a little bit counterintuitive because for the last 20 years, Afghanistan was at the top of that stack of papers, or was always, near the top of that stack of papers. So we've done a 180, but that's just the reality of the situation. And I think another thing that's hard to grapple with is that a lot of promises were made to Afghanistan and the Afghan people. And I think there's a focus on the fact that those promises weren't kept. I would say the focus should be more on why were those promises made in the first place, because there was never really an intention to keep them. And I think going forward, there needs to be realistic expectations about what is the follow through going to be from the international community. And I'd say it's not going to be that much. We're actually in a moment right now where I think Afghanistan probably has more attention than it will in two years from now, unless something drastically changes. So that has to be remembered. The United States, since the Taliban takeover, has provided $775 million in humanitarian aid. I don't see that continuing indefinitely, and I think that's another reality that has to be contended with. So going to the next topic, or the topic I was asked to talk about, which is the frozen funds. Now, if you want a deep dive into the frozen funds, the foreign exchange reserves, you can read a Lawfare piece by Scott Anderson, in which he does a deep dive about the legal issues, or you can read the Department of Justice's statement of interest. If you Google DOJ statement of interest, the Afghanistan Bank, I'm sure it would come up. And if you Google Lawfare, Scott Anderson, frozen funds, I'm sure that article would come up if you want to do a deeper dive. I'm going to really give a 30,000 foot analysis, which is that essentially $7 billion of these funds were in New York, and another $2 billion were elsewhere in the world. And so there was approximately 9 billion total, but let's say approximately 7 billion in the United States. And they were being held in the United States, which is not uncommon. It's not uncommon for countries to sometimes have their their foreign exchange reserves held in the United States. And then after the Taliban takeover, they became frozen because it was unclear what to do with them. And in the United States, over the last several decades, starting even before 9/11 and especially after 9/11, US lawmakers passed various forms of legislation that essentially turned terrorism into a tort. And what I mean by that is they turned terrorism into a personal injury that you could sue people for, which is not true necessarily in the rest of the world. So I'm being very broad, I'm being very general here, but basically in the US legal system, if you or your close family member is a victim of terrorism, you can sue the terrorists or the alleged terrorists, and if they have, and you can also sue states that have harbored those terrorists. And if there's any connection, if there's any money that is connected to them, you can pursue that money. The same way that if somebody came up and punched me in the face or hit me with a car, I could try to go after their savings or their wages or what have you. It's the same thing. It's a bit more complex than that, but it's basically the same thing. And I think a lot of attorneys would probably be rolling their eyes at such a simple explanation, but I think it's important to just talk about these things in general terms and not bury it in legal nuance. And so what happened was 9/11 families who had lost family members in the September 11th attacks had these various cases against different defendants. The Taliban was a defendant, Iran was a defendant, Al-Qaeda was a defendant. And they eventually got a default judgment because, of course, it's not like the Taliban showed up in court and defended themselves in New York City. And so those claims are still ongoing. And so essentially, and I'm being very, I'm kind of going around the legal nuance to make this, to make a point. They essentially have a property interest in some of those funds, in some of the frozen foreign exchange reserves, because you could make the argument that the Taliban have a property interest in them. Now, I know what most Afghans would say, and I agree with this in principle, is that the money belongs to the Afghan people. It doesn't belong to the Taliban. And I agree with that in principle. But from a legal perspective, it could be seen as assets that the Taliban have a property interest in, and therefore these plaintiffs can pursue that property to settle their claims. And they have a property interest in it because these legal cases have not been settled. And until they're settled, that interest is going to exist. The Biden administration understood this. And so what they did was they issued an executive order that essentially split the funds in half and kind of built a fence around half of the funds and said, okay, you can't go after this money. You can't go after this $3.5 billion. This is for the Afghan people. This other $3.5 billion, go fight it out in court. Maybe you'll win, maybe you won't. So it's conceivably possible that these plaintiffs won't get any of the money and that it could all go back to Afghanistan. But that depends on what happens in the courts. And they kind of came to that number, I think, because it sounded good in the U.S. domestic arena to split things down the middle. It would have been hard to justify, if they had only given the 9/11 plaintiffs 35% of the money to fight over. And it's also they did an analysis and they said, well, the only damages these plaintiffs are probably entitled to are compensatory damages, and there's no way that adds up to more than $3.5 billion. So it was partly based on a legal analysis, and I think it was partly about optics. So that's where we're at today. And so there was a backlash against the Biden administration, and even I was very disappointed. But the reality is the Biden administration's hands were kind of tied. Now, when you go around and you say what I just said to people in Europe or Afghans or basically anyone who's not familiar with the U.S. legal system, it sounds ridiculous. From a common sense perspective, it's obvious this money belongs to the people of Afghanistan. It's obvious it belongs to the Central Bank of Afghanistan. It seems a bit ridiculous that it should be used to settle claims, related to 9/11. And I understand all that. And I think what happens is a lot of lawyers in the United States talk about the U.S. legal system like it's some irrefutable law of physics. And how could you not understand how this works? But I know that from the outside, it sounds ridiculous. But the reality is that the Biden administration operates within the U.S. legal system. And had they simply handed over all $7 billion to the central bank, they would have been sued. And these plaintiffs might have been able to win that case, and they could have said that their constitutional rights were violated by denying them the ability to have their day in court over these funds. So that's one issue. And another issue is I think there is a genuine concern about returning these funds to the central bank, given that there's sanctioned individuals in the central bank, and given the Taliban's links to Al-Qaeda. So I think it's partly the limitations of the legal system and partly a policy decision. Now, so far as sanctions, we often say, well, sanctions were slapped on the Taliban when they took over the country, but that's not exactly the case. There were already sanctions on the Taliban. They were sanctioned and on the Haqqani network, and they were sanctioned as terrorist organizations. And what happened was there was an unprecedented situation in sanctions history in which a sanctioned terrorist group became the government or the de facto government of a country overnight. And the US sanctions regime had never anticipated what might happen in that situation. And so what happened was essentially the de facto government of Afghanistan became sanctioned, and we weren't really prepared for that. And so, back a year ago in the early days of the first couple months of the Taliban government, what the US Treasury Department would often say was, well, Afghanistan's not sanctioned. The territory is not sanctioned. You can conduct business in Afghanistan. You can provide aid in Afghanistan so long as not one penny reaches the Taliban. But of course, that's virtually impossible. And so then what they began to do, I think they recognized that, is they began to issue general licenses. And a general license is essentially an exception to sanctions. It's a get out of jail card. It's like, it's a hall pass. You can engage in this kind of transaction even if it technically violates the sanctions, because we've carved out an exception for you. And so they issued, basically general licenses related to types of humanitarian aid, related to certain types of commercial transactions. You can pay taxes, you can pay a licensing fee, you can pay a customs fee, things like that, and you can conduct business in Afghanistan. The problem, though, is there's a chilling effect, and not too many people, and certainly not too many banks or businesses, are willing to accept the risk of violating US sanctions to enter the Afghan market, which is a high risk, low reward market in the first place. So there's already many reasons from a business perspective not to enter the Afghan market. And the fact that these sanctions exist, even with the exceptions that are granted via the general licenses, it's just not enough to overcome that risk. But the problem with sanctions is this. In US domestic politics, once you enact sanctions, it's very difficult to remove those sanctions. Because if you want to make a case for removing sanctions, the question that will come from Congress and from the American people and from your opposing, the opposition politicians, etc., the question will be, well, what changed? Why would we remove these sanctions now? And too often, the real answer is going to be, well, nothing changed, but the sanctions probably weren't that effective to begin with. So you might say, what changed with the Taliban? Well, not much. They still have links to Al-Qaeda. But the reality is that the sanctions aren't really effective, and they're not really doing what they were intended to do. But politically, it's almost impossible for a president to try to remove sanctions on a group like the Taliban, especially given that midterms are coming up and given that there's going to be a hotly contested presidential election. So you really have to ask yourself, if you were President Biden, why would you remove the sanctions? It wouldn't be very rational. The cost of that is that there's a chilling effect that has made it very difficult to try to restart the formal business, formal business and financing and banking in Afghanistan, even for neighboring countries like Pakistan. For example, I spoke to someone familiar with the Pakistani banking sector, and I said, do Pakistani banks want to finance business operations in Afghanistan? And they said no, because it's too risky. So that's the effect of the sanctions. I think that the Biden administration has genuinely tried to make the sanctions less lethal by issuing all these general licenses, but I do not foresee them lifting the sanctions anytime soon. Moving on to the liquidity problem, which I think is another issue that we have to think about. The liquidity problem is another effect of the sanctions and of the frozen foreign exchange reserves, because there's just not enough dollars floating around Afghanistan, and is actually extended to Pakistan, in which dollars are leaving Pakistan and going to Afghanistan. So this has kind of created a perfect economic storm. But I think we also have to be really realistic about what would happen even if the sanctions were lifted and even if the frozen foreign exchange reserves were returned to the central bank. If tomorrow the sanctions were lifted and the reserves were returned, we would still have an economy that's in shambles, because it's a landlocked country. It's a country that doesn't attract a lot of private sector investment. It's a country that had become susceptible to basically a war economy. A lot of the industries and commerce that existed in Afghanistan over the last 20 years were directly related to the war effort. Think about bulk fuel, trucking, and things like that. And it's an aid-dependent economy. So what basically needs to happen, and I'm not an economist, is I think we have to think longer term about more sustainable economic development, regionalizing Afghanistan's economy. Exports from Afghanistan to Pakistan actually were higher than from Pakistan to Afghanistan for the first time in a number of years. So you see that the markets are already trying to work themselves out. The trouble is it's not going to happen fast enough to prevent real misery and hardship and starvation in Afghanistan. And without aid, Afghanistan is going to sink into deeper poverty, which takes us to the Taliban. Now, there are certain policy choices that the Taliban have made that I think have been prudent, such as the fact that they have less corruption at the border checkpoints, and so they're collecting more revenue from customs. I think we also have to remember that nepotism is a form of corruption, and while the Taliban are not as corrupt as the former government when it comes to money laundering and things like this for personal wealth, they do engage in a great degree of nepotism, which is also a form of corruption and has led to poor governance. So far as the Taliban's policy choices, they've pretty much done almost everything you could do to deter positive relations with the West and threaten the continuation of aid and make it almost impossible for sanctions to be lifted and make it almost impossible for the foreign exchange reserves to be returned. And I say this as someone who is relatively critical of sanctions and thinks that the sanctions against the Taliban are serving very little purpose and in a perfect world should probably be rescinded. And, I don't want to see the foreign exchange reserves be in limbo for the next 20 years. But I also live in reality. And the fact is, it's really hard to ask an administration, a U.S. administration, to lift sanctions and return the foreign exchange reserves when, Al Qaeda's leader is allegedly living in the interior minister's house, or, even before that event, when the Taliban refused to, send girls back to secondary school. These are things that make it virtually impossible for the international community to engage in a more productive relationship with the Taliban, because, of course, the international community is accountable to their own domestic audience. And this isn't just true in the United States, this is true in Europe as well. And so these are real hindrances to progress. And I actually, this might be conjecture on my part, but every signal I saw from the Biden administration is that prior to Nowruz, they were moving towards a place where they were trying to seriously return the foreign exchange reserves, seriously, you perhaps come up with additional general licenses for the sanctions, and have more normalized diplomacy with the Taliban. And then when girls were sent to school for one day and then immediately sent home, that sabotaged all of that. So I think it's fair to say that the Taliban have been their own worst enemy in terms of achieving those goals. And of course, the ultimate victims have been the people of Afghanistan. I think what's important from a Western perspective is, or just a global perspective, this includes not just the West, but also Afghanistan's neighbors, is do we want to engage in policies that risk turning Afghanistan into a failed state? And I think there has to be a recognition that, okay, nobody wanted a Taliban-led Afghanistan, but that's the reality that exists. It's not a good reality, but Afghanistan's also not a failed state. There are these, silver linings here and there. Overall violence has gone down, but, overall human rights and civil rights have also gone down with that. But things could get worse. I think we have to have that realization that it could turn into a completely failed state. And do we want to engage in policies in the hope of influencing Taliban behavior that are probably going to fail at changing the Taliban's behavior, but might succeed at turning Afghanistan into a failed state? But I think what the Taliban need to understand is they're in a moment in which there's still real focus on Afghanistan, even though it's been diminished. And there is still significant inflows of aid to Afghanistan, and there's still a willingness to meet with the Taliban and hear their point of view by diplomats from their neighbors and from Europe and from the United States. But that moment is not going to last forever. And the policies that the Taliban are enacting in Afghanistan, which have slowly or gradually become more and more regressive, those policies are turning the Taliban government into a pariah, and by extension, Afghanistan, and that's isolating Afghanistan's economy and ultimately the Afghan people. And so it's a very difficult solution. I don't think I have. I mean, it's a very difficult situation. I don't think I have many solutions except the way we need to be thinking about things.
Adam, we've got like a couple of minutes before we can move on to our next speaker. So I've got a couple of quick questions for you. One, suppose the Biden administration does not do anything and there's no relationship and nothing gets normalized. In 2 years, let's assume a Republican administration comes in with war hawks at the table. What do you expect, or what do you think will happen? Because you have individuals like Lindsey Graham and others who are keen on pursuing a more of a military approach to Afghanistan. Of course, the American people will not have the appetite, but what do you think will happen if the relationship, to some degree, is not normalized or worked out in 2 years if a Republican administration comes in?
We could risk the Afghanistan's economy becoming, even, in worse, and then we could risk, sort of a knee-jerk kind of reflexive return to a CT strategy that's just conducting strikes left and right, and it's killing civilians, and who knows how effective any of it is. It probably isn't. And the Afghan people could starve, and we could see, the state start to fall apart, and an even more permissive environment for terrorist groups emerge. I think it would be a real tragedy if that happened that way. But the Taliban also have to recognize that this is their moment. They have to prove themselves that they can consider the concerns of their fellow Afghans, compromise here and there. I don't think anyone expects that they're going to completely liberalize or anything like that, but they could compromise here and there and try to be more inclusive and do simple things like send girls back to secondary school. And I think there could be real movement, but they have to recognize that the risk of not doing that is that they're going to end up with an administration in the United States that isn't willing to engage at all. And ultimately, they do need aid. They do need the international community. And whereas the international community doesn't need them so much. And so I think they have to recognize that.
And what about the concern that they could easily fall into the sphere of China, given China's need for raw material and the wealth of raw material that China has? How is that in the calculus of the U.S. policymakers? And the additional point that what happens when you have a failed state and then you have entities like ISIS who will carve out their own place in Afghanistan, and then we have another terrorist, future who wants to attack Western countries. And then lastly, there was another question from Zenat. I'll just relay the question. I tried bringing her up, but she couldn't. The question is that if the court system sued Afghanistan and Iran, why didn't they sue Pakistan? Since the 9/11 mastermind, Osama bin Laden, was found in Pakistan and not Afghanistan.
Well, I'll answer your question first. So far as great power competition, I think it's a mistake to view, although historically speaking, Afghanistan has always been at the nexus of empire. But I think it's a mistake to view contemporary Afghanistan through the lens of great power competition. If you look, China's definitely, but they. I mean, and with Taliban leaders, but I don't think they have any interest in really having a huge footprint in Afghanistan. Just look at the numbers. I mean, the United States remains the single largest donor of humanitarian aid to Afghanistan. As much as the U.S. government finds the Taliban odious, it still remains the largest single donor to the Taliban. I mean, not to the Taliban, well, to the Taliban-led Afghanistan through humanitarian aid, which they're trying to circumvent around the Taliban. In other words, they're trying to distribute it through NGOs and through the UN. So that tells you everything. If you look at the amount of aid that China's providing, even though they're willing to meet directly with the Taliban in Kabul and engage in photo ops, it's a really pitifully small amount of money. And I don't, is there interest in extracting Afghanistan's mineral wealth and resources? Sure. But there's all kinds of logistical barriers to that, from lack of roads to lack of water to lack of electricity and infrastructure, that make that very difficult to achieve in the short term. So frankly speaking, if the Taliban are waiting for China to save the day, I think they're going to be waiting for a long time. In terms of it becoming a failed state and ISIS getting a bigger stronghold, ISIS thrives in failed states. So I think that is a real risk. But again, it requires two things need to happen. The international community need to look at things in the long term and the big picture, and not with such a short-term thought process. But the Taliban also need to look at things in the long term and need to realize the moment they're in, and need again, there's simple policy choices that the Taliban could have made differently, and they chose not to, either because they're ideologues or because they think it gives them some kind of leverage. But the reality is that it doesn't, and the Taliban have made decisions that have directly led to significant hardship in Afghanistan due to the isolation it causes them. And by the way, I want to be really clear. I don't think that the reason to send girls back to secondary school is so that you can get, some sanctions lifted. I think girls should be sent back to secondary school because it's a human right and you need to invest in your population. But it would also probably create the conditions for more normalized relations with the West. So far as the last question about the various court cases and why they named, different defendants, you might ask, why is Saudi Arabia able to own real estate left and right in the United States, and yet we're pursuing the frozen we're pursuing the foreign exchange reserves of one of the poorest countries in the world. I'm not going to defend it. What happens, when Congress decided to essentially make terrorism a tort, they opened a Pandora's box. For all kinds of illogical cases, because you're essentially, having lawyers who don't understand international relations or history or any of this, name defendants left and right, and then the courts have to adjudicate it, and they're not necessarily even qualified to do that, I would say. So I think it was a mistake to turn terrorism into a tort in the first place. But in terms of why particular defendants are named or not, I mean, I think why is Iran a defendant in 9/11? You could ask that question. So I'm not going to really defend that.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you again, Adam, for the insightful information you've shared with us. Really appreciate your time. With that said, if you have any closing remarks in 30 seconds, would be great. Otherwise, we'll go on to our next speaker.
My only closing remarks is I think that the Taliban need to realize the moment they're in, but I also think that the rest of the world needs to expect the worst from the Taliban and have the diplomatic maturity to instead think about what is best for the Afghan people long term and try to craft policies that are rooted in that.
Thank you, Adam. With that said, I'll hand it over to my co-host Michelle, who will take over, and we'll be hearing from her and our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Obaidullah Bahir, and he's a lecturer at American University in Afghanistan. He's a visiting scholar at New School in NYC, and he is currently based in Afghanistan. We'll be discussing the topic of international engagement. So without further ado, I'd like to give him the mic, and thank you for participating and sharing your insights.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I had the Murphy's Law take full action earlier. Somehow my internet died, so I'm sitting on the side of the road speaking to you. Um, Thank you for assembling an esteemed panel and a lot of people that are listening in, people that I have a lot of respect for, and we all can learn a lot from. It's funny, Adam pointed towards the hypocrisy when it comes to international engagement. I think Chomsky has an interesting quote where he says that the United States develops international laws so that the rules of the game can be implemented on other people while the United States breaks them. Um, and yes, there is an inherent hypocrisy in the way that they're dealing with the Taliban and how closely they engage with other states that are atrocious and have very bad human rights records. Um, but again, that being said, don't I hate the fact that for the past 1 year, we've always had to start with disclaimers. And honestly, 1 year later, I'm not going to slap the side of my head every time we mention all the issues in Afghanistan, because all of us see it, all of us agree upon it, all of us stood for a republic. The republic is gone, the Taliban are here, they are in power. And yes, no matter what we say, like every other speaker pointed out, the onus eventually falls on the Taliban. They have to decide through their actions as to how this is going to move forward. And there is a certain dichotomy of control that helps us understand that there are certain things that we can control and certain things that we cannot. And those will be decisions up to the Taliban, and them realizing as to or wanting to make this sustainable or not. And that would include accommodating others, whether they're ethnicities, whether they're political identities, and they will have to start accommodating people beyond their group. That being said, coming to the core of my talk, which is international engagement. And let's just be honest, the past 1 year has produced very little results with regards to international engagement. And there's a very strong argument to be made with regards to its lack of utility. Futility. Actually, it's funny that that word is so similar to the original. But yeah, a lot of people would turn around and say, well, we tried engagement for a whole year. What did it produce? And it has honestly produced very little. And most of it has been Taliban self sabotage. Every time the funds release has actually gotten close, when we saw in March that after Biden had given the decision, there was certain discussion with the funds being released soon. And then on 23rd March, we saw the closure of girls' high schools. And then after that, recently in the Uzbekistan gatherings, we saw the funds release discussion actually gaining a lot of momentum. And in the end, we eventually saw that there was going to be very little progress on it, because again, we had the Al Qaeda issue and Zawahiri hosting that became a huge hurdle. And I think Imran Feroz, or I think Qazi Zai, wrote for Newsline Mag, and he called it the biggest self sabotage in political history, probably. Um, but I guess keeping all of that in mind and all of the Taliban failures, one of the issues that really help in assessing the Taliban is one, I think we expected too much from them. This whole narrative that was fed off the Taliban 2.0 made us believe that maybe if they could conduct such a sophisticated military operation, or if they could conduct such high-level psyops, then maybe the Taliban were rational. Maybe the Taliban were actually a group that had learned and matured. But unfortunately, that's not what we see, because a lot of the times the things that they do not seem rational at all. So maybe one way of looking at it is that our expectations are wrong, or that the rationality model that normally applies to everyone else doesn't apply here. And I think Barfield highlights this, that most cultures have a compounded view of rationality. So there's always culture and religion, and those are added costs to certain actions. Um, we've had an impasse. We've had grandstanding politics, staring competition, something that Dr. Harun Rahimi labeled it as, and it has produced little results. And I think a lot of times, whenever the United States and the Taliban have happened to sit across each other, they've all started from big absolute demands, where the Taliban want recognition, and of the United States hands over a list of names that they want included in the government. So that has always been an issue with regards to the engagement that we've seen so far. But I guess even with the Al Qaeda hosting, I think it was a useful disaster, because it helped us see a few things. One was it helped show the Taliban willingness for engagement, because we saw this was a Taliban that for the past year haven't stopped beating their chest over their victory. And we saw a very, very mild response from them over the bombing. Imagine in 2001, they were willing to throw the whole country under the bus for bin Laden. And this time they didn't really say much when Zawahiri was bombed. Um, and then we also understood that there is a very flawed understanding of the Doha deal. The United States and the Taliban sat for over a year discussing this deal, and eventually they both had very different understandings of it. I mean, yeah, you can challenge that the Taliban claiming that they really did not understand what hosting and not hosting which group meant. But you have to understand that even the United States probably never communicated what the rules of engagement were. If they were hosting a group, what was the operations over the horizon supposed to look like? And we saw a statement from Zabiullah Mujahid just yesterday, or today actually, that claimed that they should have been told if something like that was happening. So it just shows you that despite all the communication that is happening, both sides have very different understandings of things, which just shows you as to how failed the communication has been so far. Um, so, moving further, there's also it's really important to emphasize what responsibility the United States has towards Afghanistan. And this is not just a stoic statement of cosmopolitanism, where this is one big global village and they have to take care of Afghanistan or care for Afghanistan. This is actually the trolley problem. I mean, the United States stood at the lever and they pulled it, and now they are responsible. Their initial invasion, their 20 years stay in Afghanistan, and then the Doha deal. This all makes the Biden administration, the administrations before him, and the administrations after him responsible for whatever happens in Afghanistan. But whilst keeping that in mind, I think Tawab raised an interesting point, that we have to be careful of not making Afghanistan a polarizing issue within the United States, because if it does turn into a polarized issue, we will see a Republican Congress taking much harsher or different steps. So we have to be mindful of that not happening. Um, and look, the Doha deal was an acceptance of the Taliban's return to power. That's an acceptance that the United States cannot take back unless they accept a significant cost to themselves and to Afghanistan as well. And they can't wish the Taliban away. Anyone who is only talking about problems with the Taliban without presenting solutions or paths forward are necessarily either implying a military intervention, or they are just hopefully or wishfully wanting to the Taliban to go away if they don't look at them long enough. And that's not really a possible scenario. issues like security and human rights, those can only be discussed and addressed once there is communication, there's some level of trust. Moving to just specific policy recommendations, and I'll start wrapping up to not take too much time, is look, the European Union and others have an actual presence in Afghanistan, which means that they can meet the Taliban, which means that they can assess the reality on the ground. The United States, the special envoy's office is talking to a lot of people, but very rarely talking to the Taliban, very rarely talking to people within Afghanistan. So their reality of Afghanistan is distorted. I mean, yes, it was a positive sign that Tom West met Mullah Yaqub in Qatar, but also the mandate given to Tom West is very confusing, is very limiting. Tom West's office, the special envoy's office, shrank because we had someone like Khalilzad, and then the office was handed over to his deputy, which necessarily meant the office was getting smaller in stature, and just it showed Biden's lack of care towards Afghanistan. So if we want to break through, if the international community or the United States specifically wants to break through this black box that the Taliban have built for themselves, this self-isolationism where there is an emir and he's mystic and he's unseen and he's in Kandahar and he has all the power and no one can reach him, um, there have to be genuine efforts of interacting with different stakeholders within the Taliban to eventually find a pathway to the decision making authority that is the ultimate go to person, right? So that has to happen. There has to be direct contact. There has to be an established trust because, look, the Taliban aren't very clear about their own power dynamics still because this is a very flat organization that was fighting in different parts of the country, and now they're trying to grow taller, and it's very difficult to assess who holds which cards and who is important because at the end of the day, they're not a cohesive entity. So the international community really has to break through and get to that. I mean, look, if the engagement breaks, if engagement stops, you're only prolonging the suffering of Afghans. Again, I give the disclaimer that yes, Taliban are responsible at the forefront, but also the international community has a responsibility towards Afghans. The United States has a responsibility towards Afghans. These sanctions are hurting Afghans, and they can only be lifted once there is meaningful engagement. And also, then you have the security threat of ISK and how they will only find strength in a failed state, jihadi Salafist groups. And this is not just something Adam said. There is actual research that shows jihadi Salafist groups end up finding more recruits and are more successful within failed states. So we have to make sure that that doesn't happen. So the Taliban are here. They're a bitter reality. We have to deal with them. The international community has to deal with them because they don't have any other viable option for security and for stopping the humanitarian crisis that is in Afghanistan. But also the Taliban have to start acting a little more politically maturely as well.
Thank you very much. We're going to get to the question session later, but I did want to ask, when discussing engagement, the lion's share of the focus always understandably goes to the West, but how has the Taliban managed their relationship with regional countries such as India, Iran, Uzbekistan? Some people would argue that their engagement with India is a huge departure from past perspectives.
I think India is a unique case where it has been a pleasant surprise to see a sense of rapprochement towards India. And I guess if Afghanistan ever is to thrive, there has to be some sort of non-alignment for it between Pakistan and India. But beyond that, we've done horribly with our regional partners or regional neighbors. We don't have good ties with Iran. We don't have good ties with Pakistan, other than the Haqqani group, the larger Taliban, are not on good terms with the Taliban. We already had skirmishes with Taliban forces on the border just a few days ago. And then your relations with Tajikistan are bad. And with China as well, right now, the power dynamic is off. They're approaching us through Pakistan. It's very exploitative right now because, like I had said earlier, we don't have a constitution. We don't have laws that dictate how trade and extraction is supposed to work. So I don't think we're doing well on that front. And something that I was discussing with a friend yesterday was that the Taliban need to not be very vocal about anything and everything that happens in the world. The more non-aligned, the more passive we are about other people's issues, the more allies Afghanistan can make right now. So it's a very tricky time, and right now we should be focusing on commonalities, on finding allies to make sure that we get through this very unstable economic phase, to eventually talk about larger issues. So I would generally think that we're not really doing that well, but also the Taliban are very new to this, so maybe it takes time for these things to get better.
Do you see any areas where you've seen positive progress?
Look, I think something that we always, with regards to even within Afghanistan, like Tawab pointed towards the number of ANDSF people that were killed. I think it is important because this is a culture that thrives on vengeance and is such a central tenet. So it actually shows that the Taliban put in an effort to control it to a certain extent. Remember the first few days of the fall and how we started seeing clips of the Taliban going around the roads, whipping people with sticks? That stopped, right? So these are smaller things, but on a larger scale, look, security, yes. The Taliban stopped the fighting, so at the end of the day, now you can travel to different places. But also keeping a lid on other groups that could worsen security in Afghanistan. Right now, any foreign journalist would tell you that they've sat in cabs and traveled to extreme ends of Afghanistan without having any security concern, right? All of these are positives that we have. Um, with regards to our engagement, I mean, we have to be very mindful of not being dragged into greater games where it is between China and the US, whether it's between Pakistan and India, whether it's between Qatar and the UAE. The airport issue actually created a problem where we had the Qataris not being happy with the airports being given to the UAE. So we have to be mindful of not being dragged into all of this, because right now our focus should be fixing the problems and clearing our own house.
Thank you very much. So our next speaker is Pakhtana, and she has her master's in English literature. She's an online teacher, and she will be speaking about women in Afghanistan. Pakhtana Jan, I wanted to ask you, living in Afghanistan, how has life become easier? What things have become more difficult? If you can give us your perspective on women in Afghanistan.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I hope you all are doing well. Thank you for giving me the mic, Sister Michelle and Brother Tawab. With regards to women, I feel like I need to introduce myself. I am a teacher here for the past 2 years, and I have recently been a headmistress in one of the elite schools here in Kabul. And it's been 2 years now. Now I'm trying to get a lecturership in some university. With regards to the situation in Afghanistan, there are a lot of concerns that I see online on Twitter, especially the diaspora when they show concerns and questions. I try to be as realistic as possible, but then again, whatever I say is highly based on my personal experiences and observation. There are some differences that are, very dramatic, but there are things that have absolutely remained the same as it was a year ago. One of them is how women usually dress. What I see, that women here dress as they were dressing a year ago. They wear whatever they want. They are not forced. Some women wear abayas, some don't. Some cover their faces, others don't. Some wear masks, others don't. So they can move and walk freely on the roads and streets. Nobody bothers them. So yeah, that's a thing. Usually people ask for proof on social media, and I believe it's highly unethical to, capture them and record their videos and upload it on social media. But this is what I have personally seen. So there's not much difference if we compare the condition and how they dress a year ago or today. The other thing is that there are gyms for women. They can go where they attend gym. I have a membership of one. And there are driving schools for women. They attend it. There are driving schools for them. So there's not much difference with regard to that situation. So that's a thing. Other thing that I personally have seen, there is this dramatic change in one may feel a sense of security. I can move or I can travel freely. There was this time when I couldn't travel or I couldn't visit my hometown. Now I travel to and I visit my hometown almost every month, and it has highly become safe. So the rural areas have become more safe. So people usually say that Kabul shouldn't be compared to other parts of the Afghanistan, which I agree, because if we look at the rural areas of Afghanistan, those areas have become more safe and more secure. There are no gunshots. There's peace. It has become quiet now. Just a day ago, I had some relatives over, and one of the women said that she feels so safe that she could, go out of her home even after like 10 o'clock. There was this time when she couldn't go out of her home after like 6 o'clock in the evening. So that's a positive thing. That's something people appreciate here. The other thing that has immensely become normal is interacting with Taliban. Being a woman, I can say that it has immensely become normal. I have interacted with Taliban like 2 to 3 times in 1 year, and it has been pleasant. Taliban have been so civilized. They have been polite to me. They would listen to you attentively and respectfully. They wouldn't even look at you. They wouldn't gaze. They wouldn't stare into your eyes. A year ago, I would never imagine it. I could never imagine interacting with Taliban, but today I can interact with them, and I feel safe. As a woman, I feel safe interacting with Taliban. So it has become, a day. Just before Ashura, there were a lot of checkpoints, and to be honest, it was becoming annoying. So when we stopped at this checkpoint, I asked this Talib who was standing there, and I said, brother, it is now becoming annoying. You're there. There is checkpoint every 5 to 6 meters. He smiled, not even looking at me, and he said, sister, we are doing this for you. So it was pleasant. It was nice. It has become normal. The other thing that has become normal is seeing the families of Taliban, their wives, daughters, sisters, which we never imagined, in different gatherings, in parties, weddings. We see their wives, their daughters, and we see them very civilized and as normal as one could imagine. And we talk to them, and sometimes we even criticize a few things and we disagree upon things, but that too in a very peaceful environment. So yeah, that has also become, and one may feel that they are from us, they're one of us. So that is the thing. So one thing, the one complaint that you hear a lot in different gatherings is the ban on girls' education. Now, people have become so hopeless. Parents have become so hopeless. There are parents who are now planning on fleeing the country just because of their daughter's education. And now they do not trust Taliban with their promises, because just the other day, this one lady who's a mother to 3 daughters said that in 1990s they were doing the same. They were making promises, but weren't opening girls' schools. So I have no other option. I have to leave the country for my daughter's education. So now they have become more hopeless. They don't trust Taliban anymore. So that is something very disturbing now, that seeing people not trusting them. The other problem is the lack of jobs. And I would say that it's not only for women, it's both for men and women. There's lack of jobs. And people who have jobs, their salaries have decreased immensely. Like a year ago, I was earning like more than 30,000 Afghanis, which is like $300, more than $300. Now my salary has decreased. It has now become $150 or $100. So that's because of the assets that are frozen. So maybe that's why. The other problem that usually, and yes, there are teachers, there are people who are not willing to go and teach and to go and do jobs because of the very low salaries. They are not willing to do that. They are trying to flee the country. So there's this immense decrease in the salaries. There is this another thing that I am personally observing, is that the health problems. There are Afghans who are diagnosed with cancer. In the past years, they would get a visa either of India or Pakistan, and they would go there for their treatment. But now it has become almost impossible to get a visa of Pakistan or India. So they cannot go for the treatment or diagnosis. And here we have a lack of professional doctors or even institutions. So, there are even in my family, I have 2 to 3 cases of cancer patients, and they have this huge issue with getting a Pakistani visa or Indian visa. So that's also a problem. But in the end, if one asks me, the complaint that I normally hear a lot is the ban on girls' education. That's something people talk a lot about, people complain a lot about. But also, you may also hear a lot of appreciation. Just like the other day, Haibatullah announced that beggars would be they would be how do we say it? Beggars would be there would be biometric for the beggars, so they would provide job opportunities for them. So people were happy about it. There were gatherings, people were talking about it, women were talking about it. One may witness a lot of beggars on the streets, especially women and children. And a year ago it was the same. When I would go on the road, or when I would travel somewhere, I would see a lot of beggars, both women and children. So that's a thing people usually appreciate now. But at the same time, people complain about the ban on girls' education and how it's difficult for them to go out of the country for treatment and other purposes and business, and the decrease in the salaries, and the lack of the job opportunities. So I believe if they're provided, especially the women, if they're provided with opportunities, of course they can do a lot for the country. I personally work in private sector, but both in private sector and government sector, salaries have decreased a lot. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. You mentioned promises as far as education. The Taliban also released a decree against things they deemed as cultural norms, such as forced marriages. Do you see these as just promises as well, or in your experience, do they offer the protections that they promise in reality?
To be honest, I haven't personally heard anything like that. On Twitter, you may hear such false news that that Taliban are now sex slaving young girls. No, nothing happens here like this. I have visited Logar, I have visited Jalalabad. I haven't heard anything like this. My family have visited a lot of other places like Host, even Bamyan. I haven't heard anything like this. But yes, so that's it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So we will move on to our last speaker, last but not least. I'd like to introduce Sulaiman bin Shah. Sulaiman is a leading business consultant um, with Catalyst in Afghanistan. He's based in Kabul. He's been working with Harakat, another Afghan NGO, leading the private sector development programs for of the organization. Previously, he had his work for the Afghan government in many international local organizations. From March of 2021 until the takeover of the Taliban, he was the Deputy Minister of Industry for Industry and Commerce. He's a Fulbright scholar with a master's degree in international trade and economic diplomacy. The discussion that I asked him to speak about is the economic situation in Afghanistan, given his expertise. So, what are the areas of, what are the setbacks, any progress, and then also the path forward? What can be done to improve the economic situation as Afghans are currently starving? And after that, we'll start with Q&A. Brother Sulaiman, if you can take over the mic, please feel free to start.
Salam and hello. Thank you, Tawab, for the kind introduction. Very happy to be here with all of you. To begin with, I would like to share two important points before going on and sharing my views on the current status of the Afghan economy. First of all, I think what we are experiencing in Afghanistan right now, in terms of economic realities, is what I simply call a free fall state of the economy. And because of the complexity of the subject is high, a lot of us have just guesstimates. There are a lot of guesses and some numbers, real numbers and estimates, a lot of estimates, because we lack access to a lot of credible data or information. Second point is I want to highlight the fact about our formal economy, which is quite entangled with the informal economy. And as you all know, of course, intertwined with the illicit economy. Some key provinces have really different economic frameworks, and they're kind of not connected so much with Kabul, even in the last 20 years. So the big questions, I think, are, did we have a perfect economy in the past? No. Do we have a great economy now? Absolutely not. But how does the future look like? And I would say still quite gray, but I think we do have a chance. I think this is the ultimate reality, this question that kind of makes all sides that are engaged, international community, Taliban, and everybody, very aggressive on their positions, thinking that it is a lost cause anyway. And that's why we see a lot of heat during the negotiations, and also not seeing flexibility on any side. Let's start with the topic. I'll just put a very short context and then comment on a few things. Afghanistan economy has deteriorated significantly since the fall. First, cutting off the international aid, which was 7 to 8 billion US dollars, previously funded 75% of our government's national budget. And due to this stoppage, it resulted in a deep fiscal crisis. Development and infrastructure projects by the World Bank, USAID, and others just completely stopped. That was kind of almost 40% of our GDP. But the worst news this year is that we are still waiting to get numbers or answers on GDP, what the GDP numbers would look like. Nobody have a clue. Two, the imposition of mainly the United States government sanctions on Taliban members, especially number two in the central bank, strangled the banking system and has triggered an ongoing and further worsening economic crisis. And I definitely agree with Adam on this when he earlier mentioned that. There is also a side note, by the way. Please remember our institutions and organizations, as well as all of the private sectors, are not under sanctions. So we have to please keep that in mind. Thirdly, and more worrying also, is the resulting drop in the supply of hard currency. No hard cash available has created a balance of payments crisis. And recently, the depletion of current banknotes has added to the overall big headache everyone carries around daily in Afghanistan. So what are the key setbacks for the economy in the last 1 year? I will start first of all with the confidence of the private sector in relation to banking and financial systems. So the economic decline was initially slower than many anticipated, but a failure to meaningfully begin addressing the situation decreased confidence in the economy. In early December 2021, I mean last year, we saw a sudden drop in the value of the currency, Afghani, and it exacerbated all three crises at the same time. Now, coupled with this mammoth uncertainty that we have, the ban on girls' education for sure has also weakened the confidence of the private sector to stay in the country. Of course, they're also parents and they want their children to go to schools, and let alone with their respect to their future investments and any expansion plans that they have. Liquidity issues and the news that banks are on the verge of collapse because of cash flow issues also did a lot of damage. New regulations, which are loosened to some extent now, had severe impacts on conducting businesses in the last year. Besides the issue of long queues in front of the banks, which in itself became a big social problem. So the inability of money transfer due to the absence of correspondence banking simply means more costs for businesses. And so basically all sectors of the economy feel the pressure, literally everyone. Basic health, education, business, commerce, everybody, but particularly the trading groups and micro, small, medium enterprises and businesses that used to be led by women. Last week's drone attack, I think, trumped any zilch of confidence that was left. Second, and very much important setback, I would say, very significant that we have to look into is the labor market. As I reported to you, the economy contracted by estimated. No, there is no good range, but we can say 30 to 50%. So we have half of what we had in the past. It has hit the labor market significantly and immediately. I believe over 1 million people lost jobs, and it had a big impact on families in Afghanistan. And by family, when we talk about families, we should think about mothers and babies particularly. So with the current state of economy, we have now very limited economic opportunities for the 600,000 Afghans reaching working age every year. And that's a bad news for human development outcomes, I guess. And they're likely to deteriorate in the context of substantial disruptions to essential services, and I believe increased poverty as well. Another important point is the brain drain for all the justified reasons. A lot of young people left Afghanistan in the last 1 year, but particularly startup owners, innovators, founders, young men and women who were leading businesses back in the day and were having plans to do more on that front. So they're gone. Now, the third setback that I want to talk about is commerce, and particularly micro and small medium enterprises. And that also includes, by the way, services. So the economic contraction has also impacted commerce, heavily. We saw a drop of nearly 70% in the international trade that Afghanistan does. But please remember, this is mostly imports, or imports have declined significantly. But on the other hand, and it's very interesting to know that our exports have increased, as earlier speakers also mentioned that. So what has happened? I mean, I won't be surprised if we see some big numbers reported on this, because the infamous coal exports have been big since the takeover, since it was a very natural, organic kind of priority for the IEA to capitalize on it because of the easiness of operations, of course, mobility, transportation ease, and all that. And also, Pakistan needs a lot of coal, so a lot of interest showed up on the other side, and suddenly we saw a huge demand in exports of coal. But also, we have to understand the energy crisis in Europe. Some people try to, have a bid on having Afghan coal exported to even to Europe. There were some attempts by the Chinese as well. But again, we are having some issues now with the market pricing because of the increased tariff policy, and also in response to the statement of the Prime Minister of Pakistan when he was talking about the cheap coal in Afghanistan. I'll leave the coal part here, and maybe if there are questions, so we'll be happy to respond. Secondly, our agriculture exports, which constitute almost 80% of our total exports basket, it's been a good year for our agriculture. But again, illegal exports of pine nuts were at alarming level this last season, and a lot of coal also, even now, being exported illegally through various points to Pakistan. So, because of old reasons, exports of agricultural goods still had challenges, including pomegranates. But we have yet to see how it goes for the Afghan grapes and other products this season. We have to wait a little bit. In short, I'll say this: these real numbers will be adjusted next year, and I hope so. At least given we have some sort of an improved context, and especially access to transparent economic data generated by government department and other institutions, which unfortunately right now is a privilege to have. Overall, micro and small businesses and services sectors were also impacted because of decreasing level of incomes for businesses, individuals, and families. So now people do not have money, cannot afford services. Those businesses are also, being closed down. The fourth setback was received by the local industries, and it was because of the financial pressures and banking issues. The local industrialists simply could not, for months, they were not able to import raw materials for their production. And since tax incentives are removed, many businesses have reported closure in different zones of Afghanistan, north, south, east, wherever. Yes, there are some local exhibitions happening, promotion efforts happening, but many in the industries have laid off jobs, and all expansion plans are put on hold. This brings me to the second part, progress. I mean, I do not want to call it progress, but I can say we have had some positive points. And bear with me, these are not like enough or wholesome to kind of tackle the economic challenges or put the economy back on track, but just positive highlights. Since January 2022, some efforts were made by the US Treasury to loosen the sanctions, permitting, for example, imports of cash for humanitarian purposes and allowing individual to individual remittances from abroad. There are some further efforts I heard are underway by the UN to support the banking system, but we still have to see. The US Treasury General License 20, particularly issued in February, was a positive development, and it did promote short and medium term economic and commercial growth in Afghanistan. I mean, it's still, again, not sustainable. These are just cash injections, also helping with the currency fluctuation, but not enough. Yes, mining and minerals exports, rocketed, specifically coal and others, but it also kind of in short term, did help with some jobs. I mean, low income jobs. But again, the flip side is that nobody still don't care about the workers that work on the mine. And of course, there are no social safeguards for the people in the area where mining happens. I think all of us saw the Financial Times piece that was issued last week. With agriculture and exports, as I said, good year for agriculture, but we have to see this season how our agriculture exports perform. There's no data right now available. Nobody released, specifically the Chamber of Commerce. They have not released any data, so we have to wait to see how exactly the agriculture exports did perform. But I would say this: the Khoshtepa Canal project in the north, the agriculture irrigation project in the north, is very important, significant. The EIA has started work on this, but we have also to understand that other infrastructure and development projects would need much more resources to also create jobs, but in addition also create new layers of businesses and value chains. With regards to trade revenues, yes, there is no extortion happening now. I definitely agree with what Steph shared earlier, that the corruption on the roads has significantly dropped. There's no extortion. But we also have to understand that even though the collection is happening and the revenue numbers are very high, is it prudent economic governance? I mean, non-tax revenues are great, but they will fall due to the drop in imports simply because people don't have money. Other taxes and levies and permit fees applied these days are just killing the remaining life of the private sector and common people. I think this policy in regards to taxes and applying more and more taxes that needs an immediate attention and reform. Some say that it was impressive that IEA presented a budget, but then again, it's just the admin budget. We didn't have any big number for the development projects or infrastructure projects that could really sort of start back the economic activity. So with all this, what's the way forward? Just to summarize and not take a lot of time, maybe to give time to more questions, is I think all of us have to realign our approach. If we say we have to engage with Afghanistan, and there are so many parties, so many people who are in Afghanistan or outside Afghanistan, all of us have to think back, sit back and think, what is it that Afghanistan needs, first of all, and major responsibility, of course, lays down on Taliban to define their international relations and what kind of engagement they want with the world, but also in regards to regional economic and commercial diplomacy. I think their regional economic and commercial diplomacy is absolutely weak. It's not producing the results that they were expecting. They have had several visits in the past to Uzbekistan, Iran, Pakistan, but I think these capitals are also now playing the same game they used to play with Afghanistan in the past, and the Taliban simply don't have the capacity to navigate or deal with it. And of course, Afghanistan in general did not have a lot of capacity to deal with it, but the whatever fragile capacity we had is not there anymore. The second part that needs a lot of attention is, I think, people need, and specifically the private sector, an economic vision. Somebody has to step up, give them a vision how the future is going to look like. And I think we have to capitalize on the current potential of the private sector. Otherwise, we are moving to a deeper crisis, and it would be very, very hard to get out of it. So we do not have, we have to make sure that the private sector, which is operating now in Afghanistan, does not fail. Third, fix the fundamentals: frozen assets, correspondence banking. These are the must things. We need to reach to some sort of a solution on this. Otherwise, the crises are gonna continue. But besides these two important issues with the financial system, I think inclusivity, giving more chances for participation, especially for women, and also education. Nobody is going to be interested to invest in Afghanistan if these issues are not resolved. I mean, let alone new investments, unless it is some people or some countries who do not care about rights. The sophisticated, big, great companies in the world are not going to think about Afghanistan if people are not given rights, if there is no inclusivity, and if there is a ban on education. And for our mineral resources to be explored and extracted, we need those sophisticated machinery, knowledge, expertise from all over the world to actually come and invest here. But that's not coming if you're not fixing the fundamentals. And last but not the least, I think Friends of Afghanistan have to step up. Individuals, organizations, we have to do a lot of more work to make sure that the economy doesn't fail, the people don't fail, and whatever we see right now in terms of poverty and the parity, we need to address all of that. I'll stop here and take questions. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Simon. That was very insightful and informative. We will open up the session for Q&A, so if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand, and our colleagues will bring you up. While my colleague is doing that, I do have a quick question for you regarding liquidity. Two things. One, as it relates to how much of an impact would liquidity have in Afghanistan? Suppose there is the central bank functionalities are restored. How much of an effect will that have on the economy? One, and subsequently, I have heard that many people living in Afghanistan who had put their money in the banks, and that money was then moved to the central bank. Now they can't access their money, and it's roughly $1.16 billion. If you can just briefly mention or those two things, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. So I'll begin with the second part. I think any deposits that had happened before August 15 last year, most of that money is not accessible, and that's right. But any deposits that are happening or happened after August 15, we have now the new regulations are loosened, and people can access that money. They can take any amount they want. And there's a lot of flexibility on that. But yes, there is a certain amount of money that was deposited before August 15 last year is not accessible. So you're right on that. With the functionality of the central bank, I think there are two things that we need to understand. First of all, uh, yes, it will be great help with the liquidity issue if that happens. I mean, I'm not sure if that's going to happen. The functionality to be restored, but it would greatly help with the liquidity because we would be able to print banknotes, or I have heard that the banknotes are printed. There is some issue with the transportation, so that can be tackled very easily, and we can at least buy some time to handle the liquidity issue. The other part is correspondence banking, because as mentioned earlier, our correspondent banks, which are mainly based in Europe, they simply don't want to do business with Afghanistan because of the associated risk of sanctions. And also, Afghanistan has been a risk full of risk country in the past as well for investment. So now with the situation happening, I think when the functionality would be restored, maybe we'll have a chance for some banks to actually consider doing business with rest of the banks in Afghanistan, and that can definitely help with the trading activity. That could definitely help our importers, and of course, when the importers are helped with that, our micro, small, medium businesses in the country will also receive some sort of relief. And the third part to the functionalities or the frozen assets. I think Adam talked about it extensively, so I'll not go in and revise some of the comments that he made.
Thank you so much, Sulaiman. So we will open up the floor for questions. I believe the first individual is Jeff Rigsby. Bear with me. He's having connection issues, so I might be able to read his question if we're not able to get him on. I think he's having connection issues, so I'll just pose his question. His question was for Stephanie, I believe. He said, his question was, have you heard or seen any extrajudicial executions, or widespread extrajudicial executions in Afghanistan that you've come across or heard? Stephanie, are you able to hear us?
Hello. Yes, I can hear you. Look, so obviously last year, shortly after the Taliban takeover in September, the Taliban did say that they shot 4 kidnappers and hung the bodies in the public square in Herat. That obviously made a lot of headlines. Have I personally come across more? I haven't. Would I exclude it? Of course not. But also I wouldn't be able to say something that I haven't seen or haven't come across, besides the incident in Herat that happened again in September. And of course we have the reports from Human Rights Watch, for example, on the killings of former government employees and the disappearings of them. So we have all of that information. Have I personally come across more? I have not.
Thank you, Stephanie. We Bahir also, Vailab had some connection issues. He'll be joining us shortly. Michelle, I think you had another question on your own. So if you want to ask now, and then we'll go to the other listeners.
I was going to ask Sulaiman bin Shah what steps he thinks in the immediate future we can take, whether outside of Afghanistan or for those inside, to best support the Afghan economy.
Well, I think it's a billion-dollar question. First of all, I think we have
I'm not able to hear Sulaiman. Are you able to hear Sulaiman, Michelle?
No, I'm not.
Okay. Internet in Afghanistan's choppy, so I hope he can make it. While we're waiting for Sulaiman, there was another question I had for Stephanie. Uh, Stephanie, the civilian death uh, by reported by Brown University was at 71,000, I believe, whereas you stated, I think, 50,000. Do you know what was the source that you provided?
Yes, sure. There was an AP report, and that said the civilian death count is at 47,000. Let me just, I don't know if I can share it here, but yeah, so the Associated Press was doing a count of civilian deaths, soldiers, Taliban fighters, US forces, NATO forces. And so the death was at 47%. I'm actually just looking it up right now. So I can share the title with you. Oh, yeah. So the title is Cost of the Afghanistan War in Lives and Dollars. So it talks about the human cost, and it talks about Afghan civilians at 47,245. And then that number excludes aid workers, which was 444, journalists 72, US contractors, Afghan national military and police, Taliban, and other service members with NATO.
Thanks. I appreciate that. It's a wide discrepancy between 70 something thousand and I believe you said 40 or 50. So I was just curious. Was that the entire 20 years? Because Brown University did the entire 20 years.
Yep, exactly. Same thing.
Oh, that'd be interesting. Thanks. So if anybody has any questions, please raise your hand and come up. I will be able to give you the mic. I believe we lost Sulaiman, and we only have a few more minutes. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to come up before we close the space. Okay, I think that okay. We don't have any other questions. Well, with that said, we'll make some closing remarks. And I want to first thank our speakers for making time to attend and share their insights. I can't thank you enough, and we look forward to your continued great work. I also hope that we can continue, the Afghans themselves can continue to hold a civil discourse without the vitriol, as that would be a progress in and of itself. And a last point that I wanted to mention is that we are in a situation, whether we like it or not, that the progress or success of the Afghan people are tied with the progress of the Taliban. And for me, I cannot put the Afghan people under the bus because of my hatred or my dislike of a certain regime. And for that reason, I do pray and wish and hope that this regime will change. They will make progress for the sake of the Afghan people, and because that's my priority, and that has been my priority, and that should be all of our priorities. So if you're if I want to ensure that uh, that the uh, that the Afghan people have a better tomorrow or work towards having a better tomorrow. And that means hoping for this current government to improve, make progress. That is not me being a Taliban fan or of that sort. It's me being caring for the Afghan people. And that is that's our intention at OSIF. Our first priority is Afghan people, and we're not going to allow to throw them under the bus because of the current regime or any regime that's been there. I've worked, helped, or tried to support the previous regimes in the past 20 years, and I'll continue to support all regimes if it's going to help the Afghan people in Afghanistan. With that said, I'd like to request my colleague Michelle to make any closing remarks, and we will call it a day. And thank you all for attending. And please follow us on Twitter, watch our video on the video that we've pinned on our website. And one last comment is that unfortunately, if Afghanistan fails and there's anarchy and civil war, we're going to have a repeat of the 90s where millions of million of Afghans will become refugees into neighboring countries who will be impacted in the worst possible way. And we will not see any bright future. So I pray that for the sake of the Afghan people that we will not go through that again. Thank you. I apologize if I've spoken too much. Michelle, the mic is yours.
Thank you, everyone, for attending today. I just wanted to thank our speakers and our listeners. I hope you guys found the panel informative. And please follow the OSIF page